When the SS ran Europe, their wives lived like royalty. Houses taken from Jewish families. Furniture still inside, children's belongings still on the floor, handed over without explanation or apology. Special ration cards for meat, butter, and alcohol long after those items had vanished from ordinary German stores. Doctors who treated them first. Pharmacies that held medicine specifically for them. They lived minutes from concentration camps. They saw the smoke rising in the distance every day. They watched prisoners march past in torn clothing, hollow-eyed and exhausted, on roads families used regularly, and they said nothing, because silence was part of the arrangement. Comfort made it easier to look away, but in 1945 the arrangement collapsed. The husbands fled, the protection vanished, and for the women who had built their lives on a foundation of taken homes, confiscated goods, and deliberate silence, the reckoning arrived in ways none of them had been prepared for. Some faced prison. Some faced trial. Some quietly returned to ordinary life and were never held accountable for anything. And some had done things that went far beyond simply looking away. This is what actually happened to the wives of SS men. When the world they had benefited from finally came apart. If history told completely, including the parts most documentaries leave out, is what you come here for, subscribe to Timelines of War right now and turn on notifications. Every person in this video was real. Every documented act actually happened. And what some of these women did goes further than most people have ever heard. Let's start from the beginning. To understand what happened to SS wives after 1945, you first need to understand the specific and material nature of what they had benefited from during the war years. The SS under Heinrich Himmler was not simply a military organization. It was a private empire with its own legal system, its own economy, and its own rules that superseded those applying to ordinary German citizens. Marriage to an SS officer placed a woman inside that empire, with all the protections and privileges that membership carried. As Germany expanded across Austria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and further east, SS families were given homes confiscated from Jewish families who had been forcibly removed, sometimes with hours of warning, sometimes with no warning at all. The furniture remained in place. The dishes were still in the cabinets. Family photographs were still on the walls. SS wives moved in as though the houses had simply been waiting for them. Many never asked who had lived there before. Others knew and made a deliberate choice not to care. Financial security was guaranteed. SS wives received regular state payments. Special ration cards provided access to food that had long since disappeared from ordinary shops. Medical care prioritized them while families in bombed German cities struggled to find basic necessities. And many of these women lived within direct sight of the camps. At Koch, Auschwitz, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald, SS housing was positioned just minutes away from the facilities where hundreds of thousands of people were being subjected to forced labor, systematic starvation, and organized mass harm. Smoke was visible from residential windows. Prisoner columns moved past on roads SS families used daily. These things were not invisible. They were not hidden. Silence was the price of the comfort. The vast majority paid it without apparent struggle. Himmler reinforced this arrangement with ideology, telling SS families they were racially superior, chosen to build a new civilization fulfilling a historic mission. By 1944, more than 240,000 SS men were married, and their families had grown up entirely within this protected, privileged, deliberately insulated world. Then January 1945 arrived, when the Red Army crossed into Eastern Germany and Allied forces liberated concentration camps across occupied Europe, revealing to the world what had been happening inside them. The SS world began disintegrating with startling speed. Officers panicked. Documents were destroyed. Uniforms were discarded. Some men took their own lives rather than face capture. Others changed into civilian clothing and attempted to disappear into the enormous flows of refugees moving westward across a collapsing country. Many simply left their families without warning. Husbands who had been home the previous week were suddenly gone. Some promised to return when things settled. Some left without saying anything. Phones stopped ringing. Letters stopped arriving. For many SS wives, that was the last time they ever saw their husbands. They were left with children, elderly relatives, no protection, and a surname that was about to become the most dangerous association in Europe. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 7, 1945. The Third Reich was over. For SS families, this was not liberation. It was exposure. Margarete Boden had met Heinrich Himmler in the early 1920s. Before the power, before the uniform, before any of it. He was politically driven, financially struggling, and largely unknown. She supported him during those early years, When they married in July 1928, nothing about their situation suggested what the following decade would produce. By 1933, Heinrich Himmler was running the SS and the expanding concentration camp network. He controlled the police, the security services, and the administrative machinery that organized mass harm across occupied Europe. Margarete never questioned him publicly. She never created any visible distance between herself and his institutional role. She understood what the camps were. The absence of entire communities was visible. The suffering was known. She accepted the benefits of the system. The furnished homes, the goods, the domestic support, all produced by machinery built on dispossession and forced labor, and lived as though it would never end. It ended in May 1945. Heinrich Himmler was captured by British forces. On May 23, 1945, he took his own life shortly after his arrest. In a single moment, Margarete lost her husband, her status, and every form of institutional protection she had possessed. She and her daughter Gudrun were taken into Allied custody within days. She was questioned repeatedly about what she had known and witnessed. Investigators searched for direct evidence of personal criminal participation. None was found that met the legal threshold for prosecution. In November 1946, she was released. She spent the rest of her life in quiet financial difficulty, socially ostracized, unable to escape the weight of the choices she had made. She was never charged. She was never forgiven. She died in 1967. Lina von Osten met Reinhard Heydrich when he was young, recently dismissed from the German Navy and uncertain about his future. They married in December 1931. Lina was not a passive presence in what followed. By accounts from people who knew them both, she actively encouraged his commitment to the Nazi movement and the SS. She believed genuinely in the ideology and saw the party as a vehicle for the power and status she wanted for their family. As Heydrich rose to control the Reich Security Main Office, commanding the police, intelligence services, and central elements of the Holocaust's administrative apparatus, Lina embraced every material benefit his position provided. She lived on estates taken from others. She never questioned how those properties had become available. When Heydrich was sent to govern occupied Czechoslovakia, he implemented a regime of mass arrests, forced disappearances, and systematic repression. Lina lived in comfort while the Czech population lived in fear. In May 1942, resistance fighters ended Heydrich's life in Prague. Lina was suddenly a widow, but not an innocent one in the eyes of the people her husband had governed through terror. Czech courts sentenced her in absentia. The ruling was clear. Lina never served any part of the sentence. She remained in West Germany, protected by post-war legal and political realities. West German denazification courts later cleared her. She applied for, and successfully received, a state pension as the widow of a senior official. While survivors of her husband's occupation rebuilt shattered lives without comparable support, she remarried. She opened a small business. She never acknowledged wrongdoing. She died in 1985. Ilse Koch married Karl Otto Koch in 1937, when his SS career was advancing. When he was appointed commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp, Ilse moved directly into the center of the camp world, not maintaining careful distance, but involving herself openly in ways that made her presence felt throughout the facility. Prisoners quickly became aware of what her presence meant. Unlike most SS wives who maintained at least formal separation from camp operations, Ilse involved herself visibly. She moved through spaces where prisoners lived and worked. She used her position to intimidate and assert authority. Survivor testimony collected after the war was consistent across dozens of independent accounts in describing her conduct. Her reputation extended beyond the camp while it was still operating. In April 1945, Karl Otto Koch was removed and sentenced by the SS itself, not for what had been done to prisoners, but for corruption involving personal enrichment. His removal eliminated the last institutional protection Ilse had. American forces took her into custody in June 1945. Her trial in 1947 brought international attention. Witness after witness described the atmosphere she had helped create at Buchenwald. She was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. The sentence was subsequently reduced through legal proceedings, a decision that triggered significant public outrage. German courts reinstated the life sentence following the reaction. She spent the remainder of her life in prison. In September 1967, Ilse Koch was found deceased in her cell. The circumstances were ruled self-inflicted. Her name has remained permanently associated with Buchenwald in a way that no passage of time has diminished. Most SS wives, whatever their level of knowledge and complicity, maintained at least a formal separation from the direct acts of harm occurring around them. Erna Petri did not. She married Horst Petri, an SS officer, and accompanied him to occupied Ukraine. a region already devastated by mass roundups, forced labor, starvation, and the systematic destruction of entire Jewish communities. The Petris lived in a confiscated house with prisoners used as domestic servants. Erna absorbed the environment and went significantly further than it required. Between 1942 and 1943, on multiple occasions, she took Jewish individuals, including children left alone after their families had been taken, to isolated locations away from other people. She personally caused their deaths at close range. These were not battlefield incidents. No superior officers were present. No orders directed her to act. She identified the victims herself, led them away, and carried out the acts entirely on her own initiative. Some of the children approached her willingly, believing she would offer them help. After each incident, she returned home and continued her daily routine as though nothing had occurred. Her husband was not present during any of these events. That fact became legally decisive. It demonstrated beyond reasonable interpretation that Erna Petri was acting entirely from personal choice, rather than institutional pressure or military command. After the war, the Petris disappeared into civilian life. Germany was full of displaced people and disrupted records. Erna became a housewife and mother. For more than 15 years, no investigation reached her. In 1961, West German authorities began systematically reopening war crimes investigations. Old files were re-examined. Witnesses who had previously been unable to speak came forward. Horst Petri was identified, then Erna. The evidence was specific, documented, and ultimately confirmed through the investigation process. The trial exposed everything. The individuals affected, the locations, the nature of what had occurred. There was no interpretation available that permitted her actions to be classified as the result of ignorance or coercion. Horst Petri received a sentence of capital punishment, carried out in 1962. Erna Petri received a life sentence. She died in prison in 2000, having never regained her freedom after her arrest. For every woman who faced trial and every woman who spent her remaining years in prison, there were others who participated in the SS world's violence and were never prosecuted. Hedwig Pothast, Himmler's companion and mother of 2 of his children, lived inside the practical center of his private world throughout the war, receiving homes, servants, and financial support arranged through SS channels. When the regime collapsed, she disappeared into civilian anonymity, changed her name, remarried, and lived quietly in West Germany until her death in 1994. Investigators found insufficient direct evidence to file charges. Liesel Willhaus, wife of a concentration camp commandant in Ukraine, where tens of thousands of people perished from systematic neglect and organized harm, was described in post-war survivor testimony as using a firearm from the balcony of the villa she shared with her husband to target Jewish prisoners in the grounds below. Witnesses described this occurring on multiple occasions. No prosecution resulted. Vera Wohlauf, wife of a police battalion commander in Poland, was present and actively participating during a 1942 operation in which approximately 11,000 Jewish residents were forcibly gathered for deportation to a designated extermination facility. Accounts from the period describe her presence in the town square during the operation, carrying an implement used to drive people toward the waiting transports. She was pregnant at the time. She was never charged. Josephine Krepp, connected to a Gestapo officer in Ukraine, was described in survivor testimony as physically attacking Jewish prisoners being forced onto transports. When a child approached her seeking assistance, witnesses described her responding with severe physical force. No prosecution resulted. Most of these women were questioned briefly in the immediate post-war period and released. Documentation was limited. Survivors were often unable to speak immediately following liberation. Allied prosecutorial efforts focused primarily on senior male leadership. Most of them lived out their remaining years as ordinary civilian women in post-war West Germany, never required to answer publicly for what witnesses had described. The fate of S-wives after 1945 did not follow a single pattern, because their relationships to the harm they had lived alongside, and in some cases participated in directly, did not follow a single pattern. Some maintained careful formal distance from what their husbands built and benefited from the arrangement without leaving legally actionable evidence. They faced social judgment and poverty, but no prosecution. Some actively shaped the men who built the administrative infrastructure of the Holocaust, enjoyed every material benefit the position provided, and faced no meaningful legal consequences. Some involved themselves directly in camp operations and spent the rest of their lives in prison. And some went further than the system required, made personal choices that no one ordered them to make, and died in custody having never regained their freedom. The women who were never held accountable, who participated in roundups, who targeted prisoners, who harmed children who came to them seeking help, largely disappeared back into ordinary German life and were never required to answer for anything that witnesses describe. This is part of the history of the Second World War that is less documented and less widely understood than the crimes of the men whose names appear in history books. But the women who lived inside that system, who benefited from it, who enabled it, and in some cases who participated in its violence directly, were real people making real choices. These stories must be told completely. Subscribe to Timelines of War, share this video, because understanding the full human reality of how the Nazi system functioned requires understanding everyone who kept it running. We are not done. Timelines of War, subscribe, notifications on, share this video,